that last phrase is very confusing, even with what little I know about what you're talking about. I think the
Well,
idea of discovery is what I was thinking of. Is like what you mentioned about, you know, exploration of the new world and all this sort of thing. Like, what does that look like? Because
mhm.
although maybe there might not be as much need for, um, I think you suggested that there was like a need for gold
Well, there's a
and
need.
other things.
There's a need
Yeah,
for some of the things that
resources.
they had through the Silk
Right.
Road when the Mongol Empire collapsed and the Ottomans and the Muslim empires in the Middle East took over. They cut off trade between Europe and the West or the East, so that forced Europeans to find another route. If they don't have to find another route,
But
what's the onus or the impetus to go explore
right.
an
But
unknown area?
how much of what the Mongols were doing was about exploration and how much of it was about conquering?
Welcome back to Dad Bod History. What if? I'm Eric.
I'm
What
Jay.
if? What if? What if? What if? And I'm Nick.
That's Nick. He's been gone
And that's
forever.
the whispers of your nightmares right there, folks.
Yeah. So, all right. So this we're gonna be piggybacking off of our Mongol discussion. The question today is: what if Ögedei Khan, who ruled up until his very sudden death in 1241, what if he had not died? Now, the reason we asked that question is because when a Khagan or Great Khan dies, all of the other Khans from the various Khanates are called back to Mongolia to choose the next Khagan. And why that would have been significant is because Batu Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde in the west, had conquered parts of Poland, had conquered parts of Hungary, and was on the doorstep of taking the rest of Europe. So what if Ögedei had not died, and the invasion of Europe could have continued?
Yeah, and I think the cool question here is like he was in the process of it. Like they had swept through much of southern and eastern Russia and pushed through. They had conquered Kiev, which is in modern day Ukraine. They'd conquered Moscow. They took that city, and then they had pushed into Poland and Hungary. And really, the only thing stopping them was that Ögedei, the Khagan, had died. And so they could have consolidated certainly their gains in Poland and Hungary. And I guess the counterpoint here is there was no unified Europe in 13th century AD. There was no Germany. There was the Holy Roman Empire, which was a collection of kingdoms and principalities that were often at war with each other. France was not truly a unified nation, and England actually had much of northern France under their control. And England and France were often more worried about each other than any outward threat. Spain was under the control of the Moors for much of this time. Italy was again
Different
a collection
kingdoms,
of kingdoms
Naples,
and papal states, and
Sicily.
so there was no strong, powerful nation. In fact, often the strongest military forces were the orders of knights, like the Hospitallers or the Templars or the Teutonic Knights in Poland and Germany. Whereas the Mongolians, and specifically in this case Batu Khan, had a massive force of unified Mongolian might that he was able to bring to bear, and it was called the Golden Horde. And when they say they swept through Russia, they literally swept through Russia. And they were devastating at how fast they were at conquering Russia and then moving into Poland and Hungary. And so I think that's the counterpoint here is who would have been able to stop the Golden Horde from advancing further west? And how far west could they have gone before they were stopped, I think is really the question.
Yeah, so I read an essay, and the essay is called "The Death That Saved Europe," and I got to find the author here, by Cecilia Holland, and she includes a map in here that kind of shows, the furthest west they had gone. They had gotten far as Liegnitz, which is in Germany, on the Elbe River, which is one of the furthest west they had gotten. They had gone as far south as like Vienna and Budapest and Belgrade. And so, I'm sorry, these are like the potential targets they had because they had gotten into Poland. So, in her essay, she writes, they would have hit Budapest, Belgrade, they would have gone to Vienna, and of course, then they would have had to go west from Germany into France, but also south into Italy, and that's where things could really take an interesting turn, because again, it comes down to how much do the Europeans resist. The more they resist, the more likely it is that the cities get sacked. And even if they don't resist, even if they surrender and much is left intact, you have to consider the Pope is one of the people who had actually made one of the biggest demands of the Mongols in a time. Remember, he had made a demand of the Mongols to convert to Christianity. Mm-hmm. One of the Khans had sent him a demand back saying, no, you submit to Mongol rule. Mm-hmm. So one of the potentialities she puts in here is that the Pope is actually, as one of the most important leaders of Europe at the time, since it's just a hodgepodge of princes and dukes and, would-be kings, is that the Pope actually gets rolled into a rug and trampled by horse, which is the traditional execution method of the Mongols, because it's honorable, because you apparently don't bleed.
Spill blood.
You don't spill blood. The rug soaks it up.
Well, you don't spill it on the ground,
right?
Which is the important thing.
So that the Pope would end up being executed by this method. But what she really gets into in her essay is that as the Mongols hit these cities, whether they sack them or not, they also take back to Mongolia a lot of the important artisans, including inventors, engineers, painters. So do we end up with a Leonardo? Do we have a Michelangelo? And those are questions that we didn't really ask about China or the, what's the name of that? The Khwarezmian Empire, or Japan even. The most important figures of European history that we think of probably don't exist in the same form if the Mongols actually take Europe. But the same is true in China and Iran. So we didn't really account for those in our discussion. But, I don't foresee a lot of those names popping up and their works popping up under Mongol rule. And it doesn't mean they don't or someone else doesn't do it, but it definitely stunts what is going to happen over the next 200 years. This is at the beginning of the Renaissance. This is like the first moments of Renaissance Europe are now going to be maybe not snuffed out, but that spark, if it doesn't survive the Mongol invasion, how long does it take before it starts?
But maybe as a counterpoint to this is, had the Mongols successfully conquered, let's say up to France, as far as west as they could go. Let's say they get stopped at France. Because Germany, like I said, there is no Germany. Poland and Hungary are relatively weak, and Italy is a mess. So they conquer all those lands. Who's to say that they don't spur an Eastern Renaissance through their conquest? Because like we said in our main episode talking about the Mongols, they brought so much from China to the West. And when we were talking about the West, we didn't really define it as Western, like as Europe. We should have been more specific. When they were talking about West, a lot of the West to them was Western Asia, the Middle East, North Africa. Whereas often when we think of the West, we automatically assume Greece and Europe. But had they conquered those lands, and they could bring uninhibited all that knowledge from China and Korea and Eastern Asia and Central Asia to the West, to Europe. And conversely, you take Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, and you take all these artists and all these engineers and send them to the East. I mean, that just like the Mongolian Empire helped the expansion of Islam, who knows if the expansion of some form of Christianity would have kind of pushed out to the East,
Yeah.
and Western ideas of democracy and Western ideas of
Humanism is going to be a few
humanism,
hundred years down
yeah.
the road, but still.
Well, and all those classics, right? That's what the Renaissance was, the rediscovering of the classics. If all those classics get rediscovered and there's this pipeline between East and West, then does that classical thought make it East centuries before?
Yeah.
I'm just saying as a counterpoint to, instead of snuffing the Renaissance out, potentially it pushes the Renaissance East. I guess that's the thought that popped in my head when you were bringing that up.
Again, one of the reasons the Renaissance happens is there is this influx of money and trade, especially into Italy, especially into northern Italy, and that's all going towards the Silk Road, going towards those connections. Which, at this point, when the Renaissance actually happens, the Mongol Empire has shrunk; it's contracted. So they're still making contact with the East, but it's not the bigger, broader contact that we're considering here. So the Renaissance happens almost in a small bubble. But if the Mongol Empire expands to this point, does it make that bubble bigger and the potential bigger for a broader Renaissance? One of the other things is how does it affect exploration? Because one of the reasons for exploration is that I want to say Ottoman Turks, but I think it's a different set of Turks when they conquer when they conquer Constantinople. Yeah, it closes off trade from Europe to the Silk Road, and therefore the Europeans are forced to say we have to find another route to everything we heard about 100 years ago, which spurred on Columbus, because he's saying, well, we can't take the land route anymore; it's been closed off. So, again, these are all these little pieces. If Europe is part of a larger Mongol Empire, some of those things aren't necessary. And how much longer then is the old world separate from the new world?
Although it's something that you brought up is interesting, is if the Mongolians take Italy and they kill the Pope, do they install a Mongolian Pope? Or do they install a Mongolian-friendly Pope? Like, I don't know. Like, it's something to think about because often, right, when Kublai Khan conquered China, he became the emperor of China, and, the Yuan dynasty took place. So,
that would be up for the cardinals to discuss with the Mongols then to say, you have to be Catholic.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a Mongol would be like, well, I'll be Catholic if you want me to be.
Sure. Yeah, I just think that would be an interesting change, is if the papacy, because I don't think the Mongols get rid of it, but I think
they would
definitely make sure that they would have somebody that was friendly to Mongol ideals, if not
but
an
what
actual
I think is
Mongol
interesting,
themselves.
I think they actually would have they wouldn't have been like, well, just install somebody. They would have been like, all right, well, what do you need us to do to be your pope? Because obviously your pope has enough political power in this continent. Well,
he's kind of the only unified power.
Yeah, they're like, well, what do you have to be? Well, you have to be Catholic. Well, okay, we can do that, and we'll take it seriously, because it seems to me that their thought of religion was you just pick one and go with it, and I think they would have been okay with, like, all right.
So Batu Khan,
who wants to be Catholic? Well, I'll do it. I'll be Catholic.
Pope Batu the First, right? Like, I mean,
he's got to change his name.
Oh,
so what do you think he goes with?
Benethin. I just made up a name. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. Well, it would definitely be the first. Whatever it would, it would
Yeah.
be the first of his name. He wouldn't take like a Leo the 10th or something like that.
Who is the apostle they think went way out east? Was it Thomas? Be Pope Thomas the First.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll say Pope Thomas the
Let's
First.
go with that.
That works for me.
Batu Khan, Pope Thomas the First.
Thomas the First.
is
Pope
the
Tom.
eventual result.
Yeah. I think that would have been a bigger impact than the actual conquest. Is
Yeah.
if they can take and shape the papacy to be more Mongolian. I think that would have been a huge change because that would have affected all of Christendom right at the time.
Yeah. Would have
So,
affected
and
the eventual Reformation.
oh my gosh, there were still Crusader states down in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So now are those Crusader states getting supplied by Mongolian armies? That changes the outcome.
It does, because now those Crusader states are being supplied with Mongols,
'Cause
and they've got
I think
Mongols
Antioch-
on the other side of their enemy.
I think you have Antioch, or no, Acre is still standing at this time. I think that's the last holdout. Man, that would have been different because that would have been Saladin had conquered Jerusalem in the late 1100s. So, yeah, that would have been crazy.
Mongolian Christian Crusade.
Yeah.
What do you think, Nick?
That last phrase is very confusing, even with what little I know about what you're talking about. I think
Well,
the idea of discovery is what I was thinking of. Is like what you mentioned about, exploration of the new world and all this sort of thing. Like, what does that look like? Because although maybe might not be as much need for, I think you suggested that there was like a need for gold.
Well, there's a
and
need.
other things.
There's a need
Yeah.
for some of the things
Resources.
that they had through the Silk
Right.
Road when the Mongol Empire collapsed and the Ottomans and the Muslim empires in the Middle East took over. They cut off trade between Europe and the West or the East, so that forced Europeans to find another route. If they don't have to find another route,
But
what's the onus or the impetus to go explore
right.
an unknown
But how
area?
how much of what the Mongols were doing was about exploration, and how much of it was about conquering?
I think it's all about conquering.
It was all about conquering.
Yeah, I think they don't really. Now they might be interested in
We hear there's some Native Americans across the sea.
well, maybe if
Well,
they hear about it, but somebody's
Well,
got
and
to
that's the
find
thing
it
is
first.
if they run out, if they run out of land to conquer, they got to find
Yeah.
new land because their whole mandate is, like we said in the first episode, is a good Khan expands your boundaries.
Yeah.
Well, if you've
That's why they
taken
went-
everything that's there,
That's why they went after Japan. They had defeated Korea and the Jia dynasty and the Jin dynasty and the Southern Song dynasty. There was nothing left to conquer in that direction. Japan's right across the way,
And-
but they had to get Koreans and Chinese to build and man the boats. So
and there was and this is totally an aside, about 100 years before Columbus, there was a Chinese fleet that sailed up the coast of Asia and to Alaska and then sailed back. And it was called the Treasure Fleet because they sailed to see what was there and if there was anything worth taking. They decided
Right.
that there
the
wasn't.
Chinese had
but
also sailed west. They had sailed across the coast of India. What was different about, and this was I was reading about exploration about the same time. The Chinese hugged the coast and they stayed along the coast of India. They actually got to parts of Africa, and the Chinese came back and then the next ruler took over and they burned all their ships.
yeah.
There's only two groups of people that have ever, as an exploring culture, civilization, have just gone straight out from the coast, and that is the Europeans during their age of exploration when they said, "All right, we're just setting sail and going across the ocean," and the Polynesians. And the Polynesians were doing it long before the Europeans were. Polynesians were getting everywhere, and they were hitting the Americas. They found, I I forget which island in the South Pacific. They found a sweet potato that only grows in South America on their island. Had no idea how it got there until they found Polynesian chicken bones in Chile. Like, well, they must have traded.
Yeah.
So it's amazing the Polynesians didn't colonize the Americas first.
Yeah, I think that goes into the way that different cultures and these people groups are looking at purpose, right? And like what you mentioned about the Mongols is like their purpose was to conquer new land and take new territory. And that was not the Polynesian purpose at all, you know? It was much more about like balance and exploration,
Yeah.
at least from what I understand. But the idea of the Mongols going across the Atlantic and discovering America and
Well, and they
South
would have
America,
they would have done
But they
it.
could have gone. They could have gone across both oceans if they had conquered Europe. They could have
Yeah.
picked the Atlantic
But
or
see,
the Pacific.
it wouldn't have
so, right?
it wouldn't have been the Mongols. It would have been the Mongols
some-
like sending it, but it would have been Japanese or Chinese or European sailors with Mongols on board with their horses. And the Chinese had huge
Can you
ships
imagine that?
compared to the European ships.
Right,
The European
Chinese
ships were
ships were massive.
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
and Europeans
Hey.
were like, "Here's my dinghy."
Yeah, comparatively, if you put the ships that Columbus took next to the ships from the Chinese treasure fleet, I mean, it looks like a small sailboat next to an aircraft carrier. Like, it's
Yeah.
unbelievable that Columbus was able to sail across the ocean in that thing. You see, it seriously was. I mean, it was, in hindsight, it was ridiculous that it even worked.
Yeah,
When there's so many other better vessels to take the trip. Yeah, that was a fun one. That was the possibilities with that is if Ögedei doesn't die and Batu Khan gets to continue his conquest of at least Eastern Europe up to Italy and France, that could have changed a whole lot of things around the world.
yeah.
I mean, talk about resources available to the Mongols and an empire being able to survive for longer. I think this might be the situation where that would be the case for them, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
In some
I think
form.
so. Well, because you'd have a very motivated Europe to help you
Right.
reconquer the Holy Lands, and that's the one thing that they didn't have. And actually, when you read about the fall of the Mongolians, is there was some talk of Europe and Mongol working together to defeat the Mamluks from Egypt, but it never materialized. Well, if the Mongols own Europe,
It's
it's a
easier.
whole lot easier to make that
Easier to
materialize.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
But to have the Mongol administration and control over all these areas that are truly administered by their own peoples, it becomes it's kind of interesting
It's
to
kind
consider.
of like it's like a proto-European Union, right?
yeah, or
Where
some
Germany
sort of
takes care of Germany or France takes
Yeah.
care of France, but then you all have these collective rules and ordinances
Yeah.
that you abide by. You all have a passport that works anywhere, but you're still looking after your own affairs largely. That's kind of what they had,
Right.
except they formed it through the sword, not
Yeah.
through negotiation.
yeah, that'd be quite interesting. So, all right.
Good stuff.
Well, that was
thanks for joining in on this episode of Dad Bod History. What if the Mongols had conquered Europe? I'm Jake.
I'm Eric.
I'm Nick.
Have a good one.
And good night.